This morning, we are going to begin the book of 1 Corinthians. And 16 chapters in 24 weeks is a challenge. So we are going to take it in a way that I'm hopefully will actually be, in some ways, I think, more profitable for us. Because we don't typically think, we're so used to, verse by verse, word by word, phrase by phrase, going through stuff, which is good. That's what I have to do in preparing for this. So that's all the stuff that we normally do. But if you really think about it, letters were written as letters. And when was the last time you read a letter phrase by phrase over 16 years? You don't. You kind of sit down and you read it, or if it's a long letter, you might read it over a couple of hours or a day or two to get the whole thing. You go back and look at it again. Well, remember, when Paul's writing this letter to the Corinthians, he's writing a letter to the Corinthians. So we don't want to lose that context that we are going to be dealing with a personal letter to people he knows and ministers to. I mean, if I sent you an email and you read it phrase by phrase, I wonder what Rick means by that. Let's see if I can apply that to other letters that he's been using. That's good, but you're going to miss the point of what I was trying to tell you. Hopefully, you would know what I'm saying, but we're going to walk through the book as if you were sitting in Corinth. I'm going to make you Corinthians. Well, no. I'm going to make you aware of the Corinthians. I don't want to make you Corinthians because you don't want to be like the Corinthians were. But the basic in your notes here, you'll see that the two commentaries that I'm principally using are Gordon Fee's commentary, who's probably one of the highest rated commentaries on the book, and then also David Garland's. And they're listed and referenced in the notes there for you. And I found them to be very helpful because they're a little bit more modern commentaries. And they bring in a lot more of the cultural background that in past you just didn't know, but more recent studies and archaeology and historical and linguistic studies, you kind of have a much better, not perfect, much better picture of what Corinth was really like. So this morning what I want to do is I want to sort of set the stage of what's going on, how are we going to look at this book, how do we need to think about it, what's happening in Corinth at this time as Paul's writing it, and this will give us a framework. And as I go through some of the background, I bet as you're listening, if you're familiar with the book at all, you're going to go, aha, oh, so that's why Paul said that. Oh, so that's why Paul said that. Oh, okay, I get it. So sometimes that background just turns the light bulbs on, right? Let me give you an example of how light bulbs get turned on. If I said, give me a line, you go, what do you mean? Well, can't you understand that? That's plain English. Give me a line. Now, how would you know what I was saying, though? What I meant by what I said? Context, yeah. So if I was a sailor standing here in a sailor suit and I say, give me a line, what are you going to do?
Fishing line?
A rope, yes. Landlubber. Yes, you're going to give me a rope. You're going to give me a line because in the Navy, ropes are called lines. Oh. Okay? If I'm a PE teacher, if we have such thing as that anymore, and I say give me a line and we feel like it and our tender feelings aren't hurt by being told to do something. Sorry. I'm getting so tired of that. What are you going to do? Form a line. You're going to get into a line, right? If I'm an actor, though, give me a line. Somebody's going to be on the teleprompter going, hey, Rick, this is what you should be saying, right? So context is going to tell us, even though we understand the words, what is going on, right? And so I think what we're going to see as we go through this book and as we go see the context of what's flowing out, you're going to realize that Paul is really doing some very personal ministry. But we know that this is God's word and it's applicable to us. It's written to them, but it's written for us, right? It was written for them too, but it's also written for us. So we're going to have to see how that plays out. And as we attack this, what we're going to do is we're going to look at the book in its context, understand what Paul is trying to say, and then say, all right, now we got the truth out of this. What do we do with it? What does it look like in our lives? And what you're going to be, I think, a little bit surprised as we go through here, Corinth looks like us now. You're like, well, wait a second, that was 2,000 years ago. How could that possibly be? How have people changed over the time? We've gotten so much better, right? We're so smarter, wiser. We learn from the past, right? Oh, wait a second. I guess we don't. So it's going to look just like now. People are people. The context is very similar to what we're familiar with. A little bit of different cultural stuff, but you're going to see it looks very much like what we're familiar with. So I like this letter because it's very practical, because it's so parallel.
Is that why you can look at sin and say sin is sin, period?
Sin is sin, period. Doesn't matter what it is. You're right. So as we look at it, we're going to see how this flows out. Now, I want to take a little bit of time here, just a beginning, to set sort of a refresher on how we have to think about studying something. So you're getting your miniature hermeneutics class, all, real condensed. So I'm going to move through it quickly. So first off, we want to realize that God is the ultimate author of a book, right? He's the one who's behind it. It's a unified author. Even though he used men to communicate, he's the ultimate author. So there is going to be a unity and a harmony across the scriptures, because it's, as Peter says, men moved by the Holy Spirit. However, it also is men. So if I'm going to communicate to people, how am I going to be communicating with them? So that I can confuse them, right? So that I can make it obtuse as possible. No, I'm going to communicate to you as clearly as I possibly can, right? You don't go, how can I make this so that they don't really get what I'm saying? No, hey, there's a problem. I need, as Paul, to write to them in a way that they're going to get. Now, what happens, though, over time to other people who read this 200 years or 500 years or 1,000 years or 2,000 years later? What's going to be the problem? Culture changes.
Language changes?
Well, certainly language changes. Yeah, this was written in Greek. The culture, the society, a lot of the historical background and framework changes. So it's very easy for us to try to read our culture and context back over the top of what's going on in Corinth. Now, in certain times you have absolutely no idea besides what you have on the page. And that's it. So you do your best. But as you are able to gain more and more information about what was going on and what does it look like, you become more and more clear on what Paul was trying to communicate. And we're going to see that. So we cannot impose our culture and our thinking on these people. Now, sinful man is sinful man, right? So that's easy to impose. Yes, we're sinners, all right. And guess what? They're going to sin. So there's your first premise. And Christians, of course, are perfect, right? We have no flaw, complete understanding, never make mistakes, right? We're still people. We're still sinners, but we're saved. There's a difference. And so we're still going to relate to this, because guess what? We could be the Corinthians, and we're going to see we could be the Corinthians. The other thing that's important is, as things progress and unfold, sometimes stuff that Paul may be writing may be written to them personally, but he may be alluding to things that have been written previously. Right? So the scope of Scripture from the past can be brought to bear in the present. And isn't that what we're doing this very morning? We're taking something that was written a long time ago and saying, okay, how are we going to apply it? So again, application is culturally independent, right? Truth is still truth. How I apply it in my society and my culture may vary, right? Because it's different. But the truth is still the truth. And I think as we go through there, you're going to see how powerful what Paul tells them within their context is going to apply to us. Because it does. It does very well. Let's see. One other thing. When we start thinking about knowing what the Bible says, a lot of people say the main things are the plain things and the plain things are the main things, which is true. Sometimes, and especially in a book like 1 Corinthians, we can get wrapped around the axle, so to speak, in such minutia, trying to pull this little phrase out and build a whole doctrine over it. And you're like, really? Was that Paul's point? Was that what he was trying to do? Yes, I'm going to build this massive doctrine and build my church and establish around it, and here's what we're going to do and how we're going to live. And it was a phrase. We have to be very careful about that. I'm not saying that you add a bunch of those phrases together, you're not going to get a doctrine. But we have to be very careful about taking something that was intended in this particular context and blowing it out of proportion. In other words, what we have to do is close that gap. And in hermeneutics, one of the things we teach is closing gaps. Linguistic gaps, cultural gaps, socioeconomic gaps. We got to close gaps. And that's where the teacher, if you will, comes into play. The bringing those richness, because that's where you have to go study. How much study do you think the people in Corinth had to do to understand what Paul was talking about? Zip. They lived there. What happens to the guys in Rome? Not much, because they were very much like the Corinthians, because the Corinthians were trying to copy the Romans. What about the Egyptians, though? Folks in Egypt. Well, they had a little Roman stuff. They had a little Greek stuff, because remember, the Egyptians at this particular time happened to be actually under a Greek dynasty, the Ptolemies, from Alexander the Great. So you have Christian, you have Jew, you have Egyptian, you have Greek, and a little, Roman now, because they're in charge. So they may have to know a little bit more and understand a little bit better. And by the time you get to now, we got to understand a lot. Now that does not, I just want to make sure you understand, that does not mean you can't understand what Paul's saying. But just be very careful about overstating what Paul is stating. Does that make sense? Too easy to pull pieces out and build big things when that really wasn't the point. So that's what we're going to try to do as we go through this class. Understand that framework, and as he explains to us what's happening, and as he deals with the Corinthians, we'll get to see what he's really trying to tell them, and then go, I get it. Now, how do we apply it? So that's what we're going to do. Make sense? So there's your hermeneutics in, 6 minutes. But if you remember those things, your Bible study, your reading, your understanding, your growth will be so much better, because it's too easy to play that context, pull out, and miss the whole point. So I ask you again, give me a line. And your question will be, what's the context? Who are you? Always ask yourself that kind of a question.
And context is a great thing, but if you pick things apart like people told me, then that can become a real issue. Correct?
Well, you can break things down to the point where they have no meaning any longer. You can nitpick phrases and word choices and all. Now, words are important. If I ran to the store, or I'm running to the store, or I will run to the store, the tense of what I'm stating makes a difference. I did it, I'm doing it, I will do it. And if you're waiting for the bread to come back for sandwiches for lunch, that's a very important context distinction, right? Rick, did you get it? Sure. I will. Oh, too late for lunch. Doesn't work. Okay. So let's start diving in and looking a little bit about the background. Let's look a little bit at the author, the culture, some of the major thematics we're going to be looking at, some of the items that are going to come into play. So first off, authorship. A lot of books. There's this big debate. Who wrote it and when did they write it and all this stuff. Good news is we don't have to spend much time on that. Paul wrote it. Pretty much nobody argues about that. Yeah, that's Paul. Okay, he wrote it. And there are some debates as to whether that when Paul wrote it, did he write it in little chunks, or did he, and this is an amalgamation of a bunch of letters put together in 1 Corinthians. We're not going to spend time on that. But it's Paul. He wrote it. It's pretty clear. Dating. Paul visited Corinth. And this letter appears, from all scholarship, dating, and all the other kind of stuff, to be written in most likely the springtime of AD 54 or 55. And that's approximately 3 years after Paul had been to Corinth for the first time. All right, so this is a letter 3 years after the fact of the time he was in Corinth. We're not going to go to all the different things he did in Corinth before that, but just this is an ongoing dialogue. And the other thing that we know is there was another letter in 2 Corinthians. It talks about another letter that he had gotten. He also has been given some verbal information from Chloe's people and other things. So what we know about this letter is this is part of an ongoing discussion and dialogue. 2 Corinthians is a continuation of that. But we know there's at least 3 letters. This one is most likely the second, though it's called 1 Corinthians. And then 2 Corinthians is most likely the 3rd letter. There may be other communication, other sorts of input that's going on, but basically he is in a dialogue with these people. Now, today, you pull up your phone and you're chatting and pulling things and emailing and calling and, all those other 1,000 things that we can do today. Well, then they had a little bit more challenge, like parchment was really expensive. You couldn't write. Like paper was expensive. Everything was expensive, and most people were not particularly literate. And if they were, that didn't mean they could necessarily write. Some did, but that's why they had the guys who wrote for them, right? A scribe or I can never say that word, emimensis, whatever. I've never been able to say that word. The people who write for you. The ones who are actually writing your term paper for you as you're dictating it, right?
Yeah, they still have those actually in college at Chelmsford.
Yeah, so they end up being people who do stuff, okay? And they're going to be writing, and this is a difficult thing. So to communicate back and forth and have this long a dialogue, what do you think how important do you think this was to Paul? If he's going to spend this amount of time and energy in letters. Yeah. He wrote 2 very short letters to the Thessalonians. One long letter to the Romans. He wrote 2 long letters to the Corinthians, plus something else in between. So something's important and something's going on here that Paul figures I really need to address. I'm going to spend the time, money, energy, and effort to communicate because something is up here in Corinth. All right? So, his authorship, that dating, it's been over a 3-year time period. This is roughly 10 years before the end of his life, as best scholarship can tell. So, he's not at the very last days. He's not been imprisoned yet. Well, in Jerusalem and then on into Rome. That hasn't happened yet. So, this is what's going on. It's important. It's personal. It's a dialogue. So that already tells you a lot about when you read this letter. This isn't just some guy saying, I think I'm going to write to the Corinthians some doctrinal statement, right? And here's the 6 quotes that I've put in here from the Old Testament, and this is Jeremiah's quote. He's not doing that. These are about life gut issues, things that are critical to the faith and practice of these people in Corinth. So let's now look a little bit about the historical background, and we're going to look at the economic, social, and religious aspects of that. Okay. So first off, the historical background of just the city of Corinth itself. Corinth itself really has 2 time periods, and depending on which writer you're reading from the old days writers, sometimes what is said about one time period is implied in the second time period. The first time period was when Corinth was a leading city that was a Greek city. It was a wealthy city. And many of the things that we see in the second phase of it are applicable to the first. The first phase, they were the sort of leading city in an alliance that was fighting Rome. Right? Now, they fought the Romans in 146 BC and lost. Now, this is not the Roman Empire. This is the Roman Republic. Whether you realize it or not, Rome existed as a republic for over 500 years. The time period you're used to with the biblical times, that's after Julius Caesar took over and became emperor. And then it became the Roman Empire. Okay, there was 500 years that it was a republic, that people were voted in and out and they had senators and that all kind of deal. But they fought the old Roman Republic because it was expanding at the time. They lost. The city was trashed, pretty much destroyed, and abandoned for about 100 years. There were a few people who hung about, but basically it was abandoned until 44 BC when Julius Caesar is going to establish his Roman colony. I'll talk about that in a sec. But during this first time period, one of the Greek writers, Aristophanes, whatever, and this is from 450 to 385 BC, basically the time of the writing of the book of Malachi. So if you want to put it in against a biblical book, that's about the same time period when Malachi wrote. He basically described how bad the Corinthians were. And they were so moral. To Corinthianize, okay, was a term for sexual and moral corruption. Okay, that's how good you guys are. We're going to describe a really bad thing, and we're going to use the name of your city to describe it. So they had a reputation. Okay, to Corinthianize. Think about that. So that's how bad the city was. Now, that city got destroyed. The Romans crushed it. And of course, it grew back better next time, right? They all learned. No, they didn't. And the writing of Strabo, who a lot of modern scholars point to, actually pointed back more to this time, but he was also referencing the same type of stuff that was going on during Paul's time, when this city was reestablished by Julius Caesar in 44 BC as a Roman colony. Now, why in the world would he do that? He felt sorry for them because they crushed them 100 years earlier and gave their land back and made them feel better, right? Oh, wait a second. No, he didn't do that. He did it because this was a very strategic economic place. We'll talk about that in a second when we talk about their economics. And Rome needed to get rid of all those pesky Roman soldiers and all those slaves and all those free people because it was crowding up Caesar and Rome. So we need to start establishing Roman colonies because we have to establish Roman culture in the Roman Empire. I'm not going to go into all of the things about it, but Rome did a really good job of assimilating cultures and countries that they overtook. Becoming a Roman citizen was an extremely big deal. Paul, remember, was a Roman citizen. It was a big deal for him in his trials and his tribulations because he was a Roman citizen. Philippi. You ever wonder why Paul wrote to the Philippians and talked about your citizenship is in heaven? It's because Philippi was also one of those Roman colonies where it was a really, really big deal, prestigious thing to be a Roman citizen. So he was like, you guys think it's such a big deal being a Roman citizen? Your citizenship is in heaven. All right? That's why he used that analogy to the Philippians. Well, Corinth was the same kind of a city. And it was one that now had a problem. It was a very strong and powerful Greek city in the past, with Greek ideals and Greek structures and Greek thinking, with now Rome coming in and saying, congratulations, you're now Roman. Blam. We're going to reestablish everything that you've known about your Greek culture. We're going to establish a Roman culture. You like the winding roads? We don't. We like a grid system. And they laid out the new city as a grid system. You had your own laws and your own city stuff. Well, we're going to impose Roman law. So we have forums. We have coliseums. We have all sorts of stuff. We have hippodromes. We've got everything that looks like Rome. We're imposing Roman law, and you guys are going to become Roman. And the people who from Rome or other places are going, cool. We can run to Corinth because we're familiar with Rome. We can go to Corinth. And what's going to happen in a new town? When I move to the new place, away from my parents and everything else, things are going to get what? So much better, right? Not necessarily. How many 49ers hit it big in the gold fields? How many people in Leadville and Cripple Creek and Blackhawk and wherever else, right? Everybody became the unseekable Molly Brown, right? Her husband struck it rich and they were on the Titanic, right? Most of the time, what really happened? You went home poor. Unless you were really smart and realized that the gold in Dunbar Hills is in the shovels that you can bring in as a store owner because there's no risk. The miners are always going to buy shovels. And if I mark them up 1,000% and they need them, guess who gets rich?
I do.
Not the guy digging in the dirt. He might, but as the store owner, I'm going to. So, economic lesson. If you ever hit a boom town, become the store owner, not the guy trying to make it rich. Well, guess what happens in Corinth? People come, They go, hey, Roman culture, freedom, etc. This is going to be great. Now, here's what happens, though. Corinth is reestablished because of its very strategic position. And there's 2 ports that Corinth owns. And they're on either side of Greece, okay? What's really fascinating about those ports, though, is they're only like 6 miles apart or 10 miles apart, depending on which way you're going. Now, if you were a ship owner and you had to sail all the way around, or row, all the way around Greece and all the way back up to get just this little short distance over towards Rome and other places, or you can pay a small fee and we'll port your stuff and maybe even your boat, if it's small enough, from here to here, and you get to skip all that. What do you think you're going to do?
It's like the Suez Canal.
Yes, it's like the Suez Canal. It's like the Panama Canal. The Suez Canal and the Panama Canal are identical to Corinth.
So literally they just went across the river.
They just went real across a little teeny piece of land, or they hauled their stuff from one place to another. If you own boats on both sides, you didn't have to pay the extra fees. But guess what happens? That means lots of good, lots of trade, taxes, tariffs, people from international everywhere's coming through Corinth. And so economically, this place went from, cowtown, leveled, whatever. Romans step in, reestablish it, and suddenly, bang, this place becomes rich. Not everybody becomes rich, but the city itself becomes rich. And of course, they're going to share with their Greek neighbors because they're so benevolent and loving and kind and caring for each other, right?
Right.
Yeah, no, they're not going to do any of that. So now are you beginning to sense this, you guys are eating and these people don't have anything type of flavor already picking up here?
It's pretty much like I have it and you don't.
I have it and you don't. And we're going to see then that this whole newfound freedom and power also releases those who are in Corinth from being tied up with the old Roman aristocracy. Because if you've had a Roman republic, now empire, for nearly 600 years by this time, there's a few families who've gotten a little bit more money than everybody else. And they actually control the Senate and everything like that. They rise and fall, etc. But aristocracy, oligarchy, whatever you want to call it, patrician, patriarchy, it doesn't matter what you want to call it, these folks in Rome controlled the empire. And the only way you could break into that is, they die. Somehow you get lucky. And guess what? How does old money and new money work? How do the Hamptons fit with Silicon Valley? They don't, except the Silicon Valley can buy the Hamptons now, right? Old money, new money. Well, Rome was the old money. Corinth was the second leading city in the Roman Empire at this particular time, financially. This is all the new money. This is your Silicon Valley high-tech people, except they are the mercantile class. So what is going to happen, do you think? Giving you a question ahead. What do you think is going to happen with these newfound wealthy people? What are they going to want to do? They want power, but how do you fit into Roman society? You got to look like the Romans. And what do the Romans want? Friendly, benevolent, gracious, kind, helpful. Wait a second. No, that was 600 years of no, not that. We're going to see socially they're going to try to become like the Romans. Anybody see a problem for Christians in this particular environment? Anybody see any problem in the United States in the early 21st century in this environment? Yeah, it's going to look very similar. And so what we see here is many of the problems we're going to see addressed in this are because of this economic situation. Not all of them, but it's going to be part of the foundation for us. Now, social question.
I don't want to inject your thought too much, but could you draw those parallels to our century for us?
We are going to talk about the parallels of our century. And as we go through the book, we're going to actually see how these components work and play out. We'll actually see them because it's quite amazing how many of these parallels of what's going on in Corinth play out today and have throughout church history. So, social situation. That was the economics, so you can already see where the social situation is going to go based on the economic situation. Because of this, we get that rich and poor thing. We always talk about the middle class. There was no such thing as middle class, folks. There was slightly better off free people and everybody else who was a lot worse off, and that was the majority. And then the few people who really had it made. Right? And who writes the books? The poor folks, right? Who leaves the monuments? The poor folks, right? Who leaves the inscriptions and tablets? The poor folks, right? No, it's all the rich folks because they have the money to do it. Good thing it was chiseled in stone back then, so it's still hanging around today. We can see it. Marble hangs around for a long time. But this whole imperial idea, this whole idea of majesty and culture and values and religion of Rome now becomes the standard for Corinth. And remember, if it was founded in 44 BC and we're talking 54 AD, it isn't like, hey, this is the new stuff. This has been forever, right? Just like everything else around here, right? It's always been that way. Well, that's how people think. It's always been that way. Of course it's that way. That's the way it is. And Rome, of course, is on the ascendancy. We haven't got to the barbarians and the crumbling and all that stuff. Rome is just like, wow, taken off at this particular time. So this whole influence and this cosmopolitan influence of trade and all these other things are making the people there start saying, I need to fit into Rome. I need to look like a Roman. I need to smell like a Roman. I need to taste like a Roman. And they then therefore start seeking the status symbols of Rome. And what is that? Fruits of the Spirit, right? Meekness, gentleness, patience, kindness, self-control. Yeah, right. Just put a knot in front of all those things, and that's what it looks like. It's excess beyond excess. It's, I have to keep up with the Joneses, or the Flavians, or whatever. I don't know what the Aureliuses. See, Marcus Aurelius. No, Nero hasn't come up yet. So, yes, the Caesars. We got to look like these guys. And we're going to do that. So, how did you do this? Money, possessions, wisdom, influence and power peddling, philanthropy. Does that sound familiar? How do I make a name for myself? How generous I am to you. How generous I am to you. How gracious I give you things. So I'm a philanthropist. Social acceptance. That doesn't happen, does it? That's why we have in social media today, right? Because we don't want to be social. We have an entire world obsessed with me and connections as society. Basically fitting in with the societal practices, general values, marriage, religion of the people in power, because that's how you got there. Now, here's something that's interesting, though, and this you might not think this at this time would be true, but it wasn't a one-size-fits-all solution. You would think, okay, everybody's got to do this and got to do this and got to do this and got to do this. Well, it's very much like today. I want to be a jock. I need to be a geek. I want to be a cheerleader. I need to be, a power businessman. I need to, whatever your affinity group is, whether you were part of it or not, the one you identified with, right? You may be obsessed with movie stars. You're not one, but you're obsessed with that. You want to identify with that. So I have this thing and wear that lipstick and, drive that kind of car. Why do you think they advertise with movie people? Because you want to associate yourself with them. You ever wonder why that's happening? Same reason here. These people found some group that they wanted to be like, whether they were part of it or not, and therefore their behavior starts trying to be conformed. And in one group, you might be top dog, part of the bikers, right? And over here, you're part of the chess club or the programming geek guys. Now, those two groups don't usually intermix well or going, hey, wow, great. I can build your hog, but I don't know how to ride your hog, right? The other one, yeah, see, you get the point. But that's what was going on in Corinth. People trying to achieve what their affinity group would be. So it's kind of interesting. Now, I've got some quotes here in the middle of page 4 of the notes, and let me just read these to you. This is some Garland quoting Stansbury and some other people. It says, the result that many well-to-do sought honor, that they could, as much honor as wherever they could get it. The list of possible options: sponsoring private entertainment games, or entertainment, throwing parties. What do kids do in high school when their parents are gone? Throw parties, yay, because what do they want? Social acceptance and status. Hey, the Corinthians were just like that. Can you imagine? Games and festivals, throwing really big parties that nobody else can afford. Patronage of new cults or collegia is what it was referred to at that time. New cults. Is there a possibility that maybe some of these wealthy patrician people might be entertaining the philosophical and religious associated with Paul's gospel and Christianity? Possible. They're all Christians. They said they were, weren't they? Nobody who says they're a Christian doesn't. Oh, wait a second. That's not true either, is it? So, new cults, new ideas. Demonstration of rhetorical skills or philosophical acumen. Let's see, what was the French salon where Voltaire was sitting there and all the people were fashionable and what they did in France? Because we know all this stuff. Well, guess what? It's nothing new. Just what they were trying to do there. Let's look how well I can use my language. How I can speak. I can talk philosophy. Was there anything about philosophy and wisdom of the world or anything mentioned in Corinthians' letter? Nah, none of that. See if you notice how parallel their society and the problems that they had were. Receipt of honorary approval of honorary statues or with the appropriate epigraph. In other words, here's my signed signature jersey by John Elway. Presented to you. I thank you on behalf of the Academy and on my show, right? Trophies. Except nowadays we just give them to everybody anyway. You didn't show up, but you were on the team, you signed up, you paid your money. You get a trophy. Socially conspicuous displays of private retinue of slaves and freemen. Look how much stuff I have. And in that day, showing off how many people you owned or controlled was important. Look at my corporation. I have 500 employees. Sound familiar? In the social climate, one could only increase one's standing via a combination of patronage, marriage, wealth, patient cultivation of connections. And McMullen argues that the key measure of one's standing in Roman societal structure was the size of philanthropic gifts and the number of clients. So when Paul didn't take anything from these guys, how well do you think that went over? See, you couldn't buy Paul. That's why he didn't take anything from them. Because influence. So you always wondered why he didn't. Well, I could do it, but I won't. There was a real good reason why he didn't. It wasn't just, look how noble I am, Paul. It's, look, I want to teach you guys what's really important. And being bought by you people is not one of those things. Even if you had the right heart when you were doing it. I don't even want to have the accusation of that. See how this all fits together?
Well, he really wanted to show how important Christ was, but they didn't want to.
He wanted to show him how important Christ was, and which we're going to see here as we go through this. And then Garland continues, he says, the crucial for any success and status in this culture was attaining the patronage of powerful persons and bestowing benefaction on others to establish an array of influential friends and clients, exerting political enmity to ostracize opponents. Gee, that sounds familiar. And employing skillful oratory to persuade others in any assembly. Talk, 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 talk. I'll buy you off, pay you off, or slander you. Does this sound familiar? So basically, when you look at this, it looks pretty much like today, doesn't it? This is exactly what happens today.
They put a lot of big words in there, but when you break it down, you figure out that
it's called sinful man applying his sinful nature in sinful ways to be sinful. And for all God's glory, of course. No, wait a second. Now, are you beginning to see how the letter to 1 Corinthians is going to be addressing so many of these things, and this is the backdrop behind it? Now, religious situation, so much easier. Don't talk about what? Politics, religion? No. Well, if you talk about religion here, here's the problem. And I've got a whole class on this kind of stuff. But basically it was polytheistic. So you got every religion from everywhere in the world coming with the economic and the trading and everything. It's polytheism. Many gods. How does monotheism fit in with polytheism? Really poorly.
And so I'm assuming that became a real problem that people were very upset.
Polytheism is a problem, or monotheism is a problem within polytheism, but that's not actually the worst problem. We'll get to the worst problem in a second. But I mean, when we go down to Trinidad, we talk with, Amrush, and he says, sure, all these groups come down here and they tell us how many people they've saved and prayed the prayer. And he says, you can convince a Hindu to stand in the middle and kneel down in the middle of a busy street and accept Jesus. The problem is accepting the only Jesus. You can add him too. Why do you think the prosperity gospel is so popular on the island? He says, easy, it's the theological lottery. Sometimes people get wealthy, so let's please this Jesus God. So might as well try a little bit of that. And see, that's normative. Matter of fact, that's normative in the world. Today, more people are polytheistic than monotheistic. And people who are monotheistic live polytheistic. Whether it's other gods, it's other things. Other idols, if you will. Now again, that's a whole nother challenge. But the idea of picking and choosing. I would like one from column B, two from column A, and the integral. Right? That's what you could do. Because whatever fit for what you needed to do, you could find some group, some religion, some practice that would let you do it. And of course, we don't want any of the gods or goddesses upset with us. Because how else are you going to get your fortune? By the favor of the gods. By the way, that is one of the Greek gods that becomes one of our English words, just so you know.
So is that where relativism came into play?
No, relativism is a modern concept. This is where I want to do this, so I'll pick what I want to do to justify myself. You do realize that most people decide what they want to do and then go find stuff to support that idea. That's pretty much the approach people take. Well, guess what? If you now have all the gods and goddesses on your side, picking what I want to do, finding the right god and goddess, so you don't really know what anybody really believed. You just know what was out there. Well, if that's the life you grew up in, how hard is it to add Jesus to that? Not hard at all, is it? So what's the problem, though?
It shouldn't be added. It should be a centered Christ life.
Yeah, it should be Christ only. Why does Paul keep talking about all this unity and oneness in Christ stuff? Beginning to get the picture. So what we're going to see is that was a problem. However, the biggest problem was not that. The biggest problem was the imperial cult of emperor worship. And many people look at it and say, oh, well, you're bowing down and worshiping the emperor. Not really. You were more worshiping the idea that the emperor embodied. It was very similar to Pharaoh. The idea of the Son of God, I'm embodying deity. Gee, Son of God has been used elsewhere? Yeah, it is. Now do you understand why that's also a confusing term to people? Because these rulers and deities were considered what you would call a demagogue god. They basically were like small gods, imbued with power, etc. Well, the imperial cult was the same application to the Roman emperor. It was not worshiping the emperor per se, it was worshiping the power behind the emperor and the office. And of course, it was just ritual at this particular time. But what kind of problem does this create for, a Christian? There's one Lord, there's one baptism, wait a second, what about the emperor? And you have to sacrifice, and you need a little shrine outside, and when you go to a game, you need to do your little sacrifice, or write your paper, or put your little incense. That's all it is. It's not saying, I really think they're a god. But in that society, who cares? Yeah, do your thing, keep the emperor happy. As a Christian, though, you can't do that. Or can you? Oh, Now we have a dilemma. But you want to fit in with Roman society. And you're a wealthy person. And you're opening your home to these believers. Can't they just accept that I got a little altar thing in the front foyer for my friends? We'll take it down when you guys show up. But I'll put it back up. See the problem? The most dangerous thing that has ever faced Christianity is the coalescence of church and state in worship. If you study church history, the lapse, the confessors, all this other kind of stuff created more problems in the church because, okay, Jonathan's holding fast. Oh, he broke. Okay, when do we let him back in? And who lets him back in? Because, see, I ran because I thought it was smarter for me to save the flock and come back and help you guys out than just die right there. Oh, wait a second. Am I a bad pastor now? Or am I a good pastor? Was I a wise pastor? Well, he didn't break, so he's a confessor. And so now he thinks, well, I have authority because, see, I stood firm. This Roman cult problem plagued the church for centuries. And in Corinth, this is the problem that they faced. Time and time again. Because how do you be a good citizen, fit in with Roman society, and not worship the emperor? Even if it's just a ritual. Wise, mighty, noble, huh? And so this is going to be a constant struggle. This is going to be a problem, and Paul's going to have to address this. And so this is going to be a big deal. Now, close out here some themes, and I'm just going to touch on them. And then as we go through the book or the letter, we'll see how these all play out. And many more that I'm not going to have time to talk about. Most of the time, people traditionally think that this is just a book of Paul dealing with factions in the church. And in some cases, in some situations, it kind of is. So I'm not going to say that that's wrong. But more recent scholarship in both background studies and well as looking at the book in general have kind of come to a little more refined understanding. I won't say different, but more refined understanding. That most of the dialogue between Paul and the Corinthians was a personal thing, and it's an ongoing thing, like I mentioned. But it appears to be a struggle more in the relationship of the authority that Paul has to instruct this group of people. Now, in the light of what I just told you about the culture and patronage and sounding good and looking good and all the other kind of stuff, does that strike you as unusual in Corinth? Who are you, Paul? You have nothing. You're not practicing stuff. Yeah, you might be a citizen. Who cares? Yeah, you're smart. Who cares? You don't have any influence. And so, but we're the guys who do. Why do you think Paul said there weren't many wise, mighty, or noble, but that clearly were some? He's trying to say, hey, wait a second. Here in Corinth, just because you guys have influence does not mean you're walking properly. Now, that's some of the faction people see. But what you find out is that as you walk through this, you see that the idea of what spiritual maturity looks like, or somebody who is spiritual, is very different. Very different than what they thought it was. That's why you see gifts mentioned. That's why you see a whole lot of other stuff. Oh, I'm spiritual cuz. He addresses all those things. The other thing that you see is that most of the language that's addressed here is in the second person plural. For all you non-English grammarian people. Basically what that means is, which I'm not, so you have to look those things up. Second person plural, what that really means is, y'all, good southerner. It's y'all. Y'all got this problem. Or yous guys, if you're an East Coast Northeasterner. Yous guys got this problem. Not you and them. Now, there are a few singulars in there that sort of point there's problem. But this is really a broad-based attack on the church in general. All of you are behaving this way. All of you are having this problem in general. All of you are going back and eating meat sacrificed to idols. See? some of you are drunk, and some of you are this, and some of you are that, right? You guys have a problem with your theology and your practice. Either you don't understand the theology, or you don't understand how to apply the theology. One of the two, or both. You might not understand it, nor how to apply it. And I have to fix that problem. And Paul is very direct. You know, everybody says, oh, Paul was such a gentle soul. I came to them as a nursing babe. I don't know about you, but when I read this letter, it doesn't sound like Paul's going, okay, guys, it's all right, no problem. He's like, you're wrong. Let me explain it. Matter of fact, he's sarcastic. He's cutting. Because he's dealing with a real problem. He's not, okay, guys, you kind of wandered off the path a little bit. You guys are out of bounds. Stem to stern, top to bottom, front to back. Which is the same as stem and stern, but for non-naval people. So the other thing that we're going to see is a lot of them, you know, you can call it the gospel or whatever. Their practice and theology weren't matching. But also one of the things that a lot of scholars point out is that what they call over-realized eschatology. In other words, you don't know how to live properly in the inter-advent end times, but not the end times, depending on which end times you're talking about, right? Because end times contextually means different things. But we're in the end times. We've been in the end times. They were in the end times, right? So what he's saying is you guys don't understand. So why is the topic of resurrection mentioned in chapter 15? Some say this and are disturbing people. Well, you don't get what the resurrection of the dead means. You don't understand what this is going on. You don't get it. It's not like, let me talk to you about the resurrection. He's saying you guys are not living properly with the proper mindset and the proper understanding in this time. This inter-advent. You do not get it. And those thoughts of how to live in the end times are prevalent. So he's not only addressing their theology, he's addressing their life. And I am not going to tell you that life is easy. Anybody think life is easy? It's clear, right? Sure, just read this passage, quote one verse, and you're cool, right? Sorry, if you think that, come see me afterwards, because it ain't that way. Been a believer for almost 53 years. It doesn't work that way. It doesn't work that way for the Corinthians. It does not work that way for us. And we are going to see their fight and struggle is our fight and struggle. Their misunderstandings are our misunderstandings. It might look a little different. We don't wear togas. Right? We don't wear togas. It's a type of dress. Clothing. So we look different, but we're no different. We are going to see as we walk through here, and I hope you get the idea that with all of this behind it, as you read, go home and read, it's chapter 1. And look, and just as he opens the letter, look at what he's going to talk about. Look at how he's going to open up. Look at how he's going to greet them. Look at how he's going to communicate with them. And I bet you're going to start seeing these things already just lifting the text off the page and not taking it and changing it, but taking it from sort of a black and white, old, scratchy film to maybe color. You know, we move from the talkies and whatever to the Wizard of Oz. You know, Dorothy and Land of Oz. Hopefully it'll change that way. And then over time, as you see more and more, you'll begin to understand that now it moves into 3D and stereo and, you know, all the other kinds of stuff. And you'll see the richness and the beauty that we're going to see in this book. So, until next time.